Well, it's obviously a very difficult case where there's extreme polarisation of views, but one medical expert from the United States, in fact, the medical expert on the experimental treatment, said in the first High Court hearing that he thought there was a low but non-zero chance that this treatment would have some benefit. And in my view, it's worth the pain and suffering of 3 months of intensive care to see whether there is some improvement and how great that improvement is. Because Charlie Gard is going to die without treatment, and in 3 months' time, treatment can still be withdrawn. So it seemed to me a reasonable price to pay for the chance of getting to a stage where life is worth living. Now, I can understand there's reasonable disagreement about that. So some people think that it's a price that's too high to pay. So my colleague Dominic Wilkinson, a neonatal intensive care specialist and ethicist, thinks it's a price not worth paying. Peter Singer and I both think it is a price worth paying. So this is a case where people can disagree about the ethical issue. And in those kinds of cases, I think we should defer either to the parents or to the course of action that gives the person a chance. So it's not that I'm sure I have the right answer. What I'm arguing is that this is a case where there can be reasonable disagreement. Well, I think this is a case where we have to be a bit more concrete about what constitutes a life that's worth living, what the goalposts are for this kind of case. Is it that we just want somebody who is conscious, or is it that they should be conscious and capable of experiencing some pleasure and that the pain doesn't outweigh the pleasure? Or is it that we require that they have some kind of minimal social interaction? Or do we want them to be able to communicate? Or do we want them to have some level of independence? So there's various different lines that can be drawn, but this question has not been addressed. And until we set that criterion, we can't know whether a treatment is successful or not successful. And at the moment, we don't know what the goal is, and we don't know what the chances are of achieving that. So we have some ethical work to be done, and we also need to gather more information about whether it's possible for Charlie to reach what we agree is a life worth living or a meaningful life. And it's important to remember that his parents haven't argued that his life has to be continued at any cost, and no matter how bad it is. And I think that a good place to start would be, as the expert in the original case said, is to set some endpoints and to see how close we can get to those. And I think maybe we have reached that. I don't know the facts of the situation. If there was no brain function, then there would be no chance of any improvement. But the evidence, as far as I've seen, is that the structure of his brain was, at least in March, normal, and the expert at that time thought that there was some prospect of crossing a threshold. I don't know what threshold he had in mind, and I don't know what threshold the court or the doctors have in mind. And I think that's a very important ethical issue that we need to get clearer on. I certainly agree that lines have to be drawn. And, a line was drawn in April, and each court supported that line. In my view, we could take account of reasonable disagreement and set a different line. But I do agree that at some point we have to say enough is enough, and, we have to stop treatment if the line hasn't been crossed. But the issue is, where do you draw the line, and who should be involved in setting that line? And, first of all, I think, in my view, the evidence of the independent US expert gave us another perspective. And I also think it's an important societal discussion that philosophers and ethicists and everyone can contribute to about what kind of line is a life worth not worth living, is a life worth living, and how great should the chance be in order to sort of embark upon trying to achieve that. And those are ethical issues. You know, whether Charlie's situation conforms to a framework that we develop depends on the specific facts. But there's a lot of ethical work to be done in these kinds of cases. At the heart of this is a deep and important ethical question, and I think what you're seeing in the sort of outpourings of people's emotions and the involvement of people like the Pope and Donald Trump is dissatisfaction about the way in which the lines have been drawn. And I think it's our responsibility to try to think, you know, again and more deeply and from a diverse range of perspectives about those lines and where to draw them. The parents, you know, are the ones who have brought the child into the world, that will have to live with the decision, that will have to live with the child, you know, if the child survives. And they obviously have a massive stake, and they should have very considerable freedom, and their views are very important. However, they're not incorrigible. It's not as if parents can't make mistakes. There is a thing called child abuse, and child abuse can be subjecting children to medical procedures that have no prospect of improving that child's condition. But I don't think the parents in this case fit into that category. I think their views were reasonable. They went against the doctors involved in the case, but there were other doctors, or at least one other doctor, and now several doctors, who support their decision. So in view of the fact that there's disagreement amongst experts and disagreement amongst experts in ethics, I think we ought to take seriously their wishes. So it's not that anything goes, but I think where there's reasonable disagreement, we ought to give weight to the parents' own views, and indeed to erring on the side of a chance of a life worth living. Well, again, my understanding of the treatment is the treatment itself is very cheap. The treatment itself, I've heard a figure of something like £600 a month, but the intensive care that's necessary costs £1,500 a day. You know, so a 3-month course of intensive care to give him a trial treatment would be £150,000. Now, I think there's a very good argument that, given the very low chances, that is just something that is too expensive to offer. That's a different argument to saying that Charlie would be better off not receiving it. So I think that there is a much more tractable and justifiable argument that this kind of treatment is possibly of benefit, but beyond the realms of what a public health system can afford. But that wasn't the argument given by the doctors. That wasn't involved in the judgment. And anyway, Charlie Gard's parents have raised funds to take him to the US to pay for the treatment themselves, or through the people who have donated money. So that argument, as promising as it might have been, doesn't apply in this particular case. I think it's very hard to argue that somebody is better off dead when there's a prospect of their condition improving, and there's a world expert at a world-leading centre who says otherwise. I think that there are lives that are not worth living. There's a skin condition, epidermolysis bullosa, when in the very most severe form, and the child dies in the first year after the skin just relentlessly peeling off. That's a condition where there's only pain. But in this case, we have the prospect, according to some experts, of some improvement. Well, I think the importance of innovation and experimentation has been underplayed in this case. And, this is the 21st century. We should be benefiting from scientific advances. And, of course, we shouldn't be causing people to suffer in order to gain that knowledge. But if, for example, Charlie was brain dead or permanently unconscious, and a trial of experimental therapy could yield extremely important information for future patients, and his parents were agreeable to a short trial of that treatment, I think it could be justifiable. I think it turns on the degree of harm it would, or risk it would involve for the patient. But the fact that a particular child will not benefit, it doesn't close down the discussion, because it's quite legitimate to think about future patients, and indeed many parents want their child's death to have some benefit, to see there was some purpose to it. And I don't think that view should be discarded on so-called ethical grounds. I think it's an important debate to be had, and it will depend on the specifics of the case. But it is possible that in some circumstances, an experimental treatment could be tried for the benefit of other patients. As important, as experimentation is, in the case of Charlie Gard, he is conscious and capable of experiencing pain, and I don't believe that he should be subjected to intensive care purely for the purposes of experimentation if it holds no prospect of benefiting him, because he is capable of suffering, and that has to be taken very seriously. I've seen in the media that some people have questioned the involvement of people in discussing this case without knowing the specific facts and without knowing the details of the situation. And I think that it's important not to jump to conclusions about this specific case, but it does involve important principles and ethical issues that warrant wide discussion in society around what is a life worth living and what the chances are that we should take to try to achieve that. Those sorts of discussions need to involve people beyond just doctors and lawyers, and the extent to which they apply to Charlie's situation will of course depend on the facts, but I do think it's important to have wide societal discussion of these kinds of cases, and I do think it's important to present the rationale for decisions in such public cases, as happened in the publication of the court decision, which gives us some insight into the kinds of facts that were considered and the kinds of principles. But of course, in any ethical issue, you can only make a decision about what ought to be done when you know all of the facts. But that doesn't stop there being a wider discussion about what the principles and relevant concepts are for that decision. And I think it's healthy that there's some discussion of those principles and concepts.